Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Death and Sex Podcast, Part 3. Because today we're talking about The Last of Us, Part 1, Part 2, and the TV show. With me always is Dr. Kailey Bradley. Hello, Dr. Bradley.
Morning.
And as a very special guest and a good friend of the podcast, he is now Dr. Matthew Stratton. Hello, Dr. Stratton.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm not going to call you Dr. Stratton anymore for the rest of the podcast.
That's okay. I don't know that I could handle that if you did.
Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I live out in the suburbs of Chicago, and professionally speaking, am currently working as a postdoctoral researcher in pharmacology and neuroscience. So sort of like my background is RNA-based therapeutics for neurodegenerative and neurodevelopmental disorders. But personally speaking, I just am someone who has played video games and watched TV for most of my life, probably since like the age of 3. And as it's relevant to the love between a parent and child, I'm also a father of a 2-year-old.
All right. Well, thanks for doing that. What did you say your research is in what? Pharmacology and neuroscience?
Yeah. So right now I am in the pharmacology and molecular pharmacology and neuroscience department at Loyola University, Chicago.
All right, Mr. Scientist. All right. Hey, thanks for being here. We're glad to have you here. So, Kailey, you can help me out here, but our goal today is you and I both recently finished watching the TV show, The Last of Us Season 2. It just aired about a week ago. So we're talking about it today because, one, we both really like the TV show. I have played the game, I think, all the way through 3 times now because I love it so much. Also hate it so much because it makes me do things that I don't ever want to do. But also, it is really profoundly steeped in grief and loss and relationships, which this is the Death and Sex Podcast, kind of hits a lot of those areas. So I know that it resonates with Matt and I as gamers. As a non-gamer, Kailey, give us a little perspective of your experience, especially as someone that does death and grief work. What is it about The Last of Us that I think not just Matt and I, but audiences have really picked up and resonated on in The Last of Us?
Yeah, I think the depiction of grief is just really profound. And I've seen you play parts of the games. You know, I have not played. I am not a gamer, as you said, but I think how unprocessed grief can lead us places and kind of impact our life trajectories in ways that maybe we wouldn't necessarily want or desire. I think is just really powerful. I think the main character, well, I guess, could you call Joel the main character, or is it Ellie? One of the main characters, we'll say. Joel loses his daughter, Sarah, and I think he doesn't necessarily know or have the tools in any way to cope with that. And you know, the response is violence, is anger, all of that. And it actually kind of reminded me a little bit of my very first counseling job. I was working at a juvenile detention center for teens, and they had no coping mechanisms to process what they really were sitting in my office wanting to talk about, which was grief. And so, yeah, I just think it's a very powerful depiction of maybe the consequences of unprocessed grief.
I just realized as you were talking that we haven't even talked about what is The Last of Us. So we should probably do that too before we dive any deeper. Well, spoiler alert.
If this far and you don't know what The Last of Us is, like, kudos to you for still listening.
Thanks, Matt. Yes. So just real quick recap. The Last of Us is a video game and TV show in a post-apocalyptic zombie world. They never use the word zombies, where mushrooms or cordyceps, and Matt, Mr. Scientist over there, can give us some information on mushrooms and cordyceps, maybe. I don't know, because it impacts the brain.
Maybe. I mean, I'm not a mycologist. I am familiar with cordyceps.
All right, Mr. Scientist, using these fancy terms. I'm just teasing. So basically these cordyceps, these mushrooms, this fungus basically infects people, infects the brain, turns them into zombies in this post-apocalyptic world. And the thrust of the first season or the first game is this character, Joel, who lost his daughter, has to take care of and take care of a young girl and get her across the country in a post-apocalyptic USA to this base because she is immune. She is immune from the disease. And again, this is spoilers, especially for the first season and the first game. They get to where they need to go after going through some horrific events together. They form this unique father-daughter bond. And then Joel, one of the main characters, Ellie's the girl, gets to the base. They're going to create a serum a vaccine for this disease. But Joel learns that in order to do that, Ellie must die. And Joel, who has his own trauma, and this is important because we can talk about that as well, does not like this and basically goes Rambo and ends up killing many people in that base. And then as a result, we see that that Joel has to live with this consequence of not having Ellie be saved. In fact, Ellie is very much alive, and Ellie is questioning what happened. Joel won't tell her. And so the season in the show ends on this cliffhanger of, does Ellie know, does Ellie not know that Joel ended up choosing her over the world? So that's the recap of season 1 and The Last of Us Part 1. And then season 2 is dealing with the consequences of a very big death. And this is definitely a huge spoiler if you don't want to know, but a group of young individuals who were at that base come back. They get their revenge on Joel. Joel dies, and now Ellie wants revenge. And it's the season 2 and the part 2 is very much a revenge story set in this post-apocalyptic world. So just that was the quick recap. Pause. Let's pause real quick. Taylor, Matt, you okay?
Yeah, I am not sure what happened. All of a sudden, my camera just turned off. I still had the little light up here that said it was on, but just the Riverside thing was saying that it was unable to use it. And then it said that it wasn't recording me anymore either.
Okay. All right.
So
that's right.
I had to get kicked out and come back in, but everything's fine now. I don't know what happened.
All right. Great. We'll keep going. So unpause. So that was a bit rambly. Sorry about that. But that's the quick recap of the show. But that's important to catch us up to season 2, because part of what we want to talk about today is the results of death, trauma, choosing a child over basically all of mankind. Did Joel make the right choice? We'll have to answer that question. But then also this idea of revenge. And what I really love about the second video game is this huge exercise in empathy, which I really want to talk about today too. So yeah, let me ask you guys this question, because I think it's a good question to maybe just jumpstart more conversation. Did Joel make the right choice by choosing Ellie? Matt, what do you think?
Into the deep end with that question.
Yeah, right. Gosh, I mean, my knee-jerk reaction is to say that I don't feel like there's a definitive answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's so much that goes into answering that question, and I think that's part of what makes it good art, is that it is provocative and thought-provoking, and is a situation where you theoretically feel like things should go one way, but in practicality, if you were in his same position, you might make a different choice than what you as a removed person think was the right choice. Because I feel like on some level, there needs to be an acknowledgement that as Dr. Spock famously said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And how do you place the life of one girl above that of all of humanity? But at the same time, we are social creatures that form these close bonds with one another. And so how do you put someone that you personally know and love at harm and at risk for this theoretical mass of people that you have no connection with? And if you do have a connection with them, like in Joel's case, it's probably antagonistic.
Mm-hmm.
To some extent, it makes me think of on the big and the micro cosm level of when I was in middle school, I remember we learned about the Holocaust and we read the diary of Anne Frank. And my teacher impressed upon us that it is one thing to hear that 6 million people were killed. It is another thing to read the personal writings of one of those people and how much more that impacts you.
Yeah.
On some level, we psychologically connect to people more on a one-to-one level than we do on this big picture level, just because at a certain point, how do you even comprehend 6 million lives? Or in the case of The Last of Us, billions of lives.
If there were still billions of lives to save in a post-apocalyptic world.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know how many.
We don't know the numbers.
People are still out there, right?
Yeah. But no, I'm kind of a little taken aback just by that idea that, it's one thing to read 6 million people died. It's another thing to read one person's personal story. But I do think that's what makes The Last of Us so close to home, because it is so intimate and personal. Like it's that narrative of just these two people. What are your thoughts, Kailey, about that question and anything Matt said? Did Joel make the right choice?
Yeah, it just makes me think about a lot of the work that I've done with grieving parents. And I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of, bereaved parents, but I think, they might say that Joel absolutely made, the right decision in terms of, if I could have my child here with me, I would have done exactly what Joel would have done. So I think, my lens of the work that I've done with grieving parents, I think gives me a little bit of a different maybe perspective, but I totally agree. It's such a philosophical, angsty question to have to think about. Yeah. Does any one life, have more worth and value than any other? So,
Kailey, what you said made me think that, like, on some level, we're trying to answer the question, was it the right or the wrong decision? Yeah. And I feel like what you're saying that is absolutely true is it was an understandable decision.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was right or wrong, it was understandable.
Yeah. Matt, did you see that Neil Druckmann actually gave an answer to this question, the creator of the video game?
About whether or not it would work or whether or not it was the right choice? I did not see this. That's interesting.
So Neil Druckmann did say, and I think it was on IGN, he said, "I believe Joel was right. If I were in Joel's position, I hope I would be able to do what he did to save my daughter." Where I fall on this is the idea of consent. I think it would be absolutely, yes, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. I think for me, if Ellie had been able to give consent and this is what I want, that would have been a much obviously healthier way to go about things. It also, and this goes into trauma, and we can talk about trauma here too, it also would have gone a long way, I think, in working through Joel's trauma. Because here's a thought, and you guys give me your perspective, and I don't want to be leading with all the questions here. So feel free to ask questions of your own or thoughts, or jump in with thoughts that both of you have. But when I think about, in the work that I do, when I work with couples or work with individuals, especially people that are in abusive relationships or have been abusive relationships, part of the reason why those kinds of things tend to happen is one person is so afraid either of being hurt or of not getting what they want or what they think they want or they deserve, that they wrest power and control in the relationship from the other person. And I'm kind of curious, we talk about trauma. I think when people experience trauma, we do whatever we can to control the situation so we don't get hurt again. And I think in the context of what Joel did, power and control, I think played a big role for him. And in the ending, especially of part one, is it about the love that he has for Ellie, or is it more about the control of, I can't stand to lose this again? And I feel like they address that a little bit in part two and in season two in a conversation that Joel and Ellie have on the porch, which is towards the end of part two, the video game, and towards the end of season two, there's a conversation that Joel and Ellie have after the dance with Dina. But yeah, what are your guys' thoughts about that? Is because of the trauma, do you think Joel is really acting out of love for this surrogate daughter, or do you think it's more of this response of control, or maybe both?
I was going to say,
can both
¿por qué no los dos?
Why not both? Yeah, I would say, I love that. Now I'm hungry and I want Taco Bell.
Yeah, brief pause so we can go eat tacos now.
Right. It's interesting you bring up this issue of, control, Stephen, because think about the environment that Joel and Ellie are living in. It's a post-apocalyptic world where they literally have no control over anything. Their entire world has been shattered, right? Their entire sense of that the world is safe, that the world is predictable, that there are certain standards that we go by. I mean, all of that has just been tossed out the window. And so I think not just Joel, but so many of the characters in The Last of Us, their behavioral responses are an attempt to kind of get some sort of control back because they don't have any, right? This world is completely, unpredictable and safe. And how do you make meaning in a world like that? That's a big question that I think the show does such a beautiful job at getting the audience to think about. How do you create meaning when you're really in a meaningless environment?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Kailey, about just because I think that, especially because of the way that the first game and the first season of the show opens, that there is this obvious understanding that Joel has experienced trauma through the sudden loss of his daughter, but it almost eclipses the reality that like this entire world is just trauma. That every human being on the planet has suddenly had their lives and the control of their lives ripped from their hands. And so it's not just a story about the trauma of Joel's loss of his daughter, but it's everybody that you play as and that you interact with coping in the aftermath of an unprecedented situation. I think to your point, though, Steve, earlier about the idea of consent and, you know, how would it look differently if Ellie had been given all of the information and had been able to weigh in on that? I think that definitely is like an aspect that was purposefully like omitted from the story in a way that like part of what makes it powerful is that, you know, Ellie is left in the dark, at least up until part 2. And that's part of what you wrestle with as the player and as the viewer is like, I can't believe that he didn't even like run this by her, that like he just made the decision in a vacuum when it's her life that's in the balance. But then also when you're talking about consent and especially informed consent when it relates to a medical procedure like that, I feel like one of the things that you have to remember is that even if like you as the player are an adult, Ellie's 14. And so like, what does it look like to give consent to sacrifice your life as a 14-year-old? Is Ellie even at the place biologically, neurologically, psychologically to comprehend that and make an actual informed consent on that? Because at least as it relates to, you know, everyday medical procedures in our world, it's the parents who make the call for a 14-year-old.
Yeah, definitely a 14-year-old does not, I think. Let's validate the fact that she's grown up in this post-apocalyptic world where a lot of our medical laws and ethics don't exist, clearly, because they're going to perform surgery on a 14-year-old. It's going to kill her without her knowledge, too. Let's acknowledge that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very different context than the one we live in.
We don't have a bioethics committee.
There was no bioethics team involved when discussing this procedure.
Yeah, and the apocalypse forces you to grow up pretty fast, but at least within our context, she's a child.
She is.
Well, that's exactly what I was. Yes, she had to grow up faster. Having said that, we all know that the human brain doesn't stop developing or growing until you're around 25, your mid 20s. So, you know, still developing brain going on there. So yes, so you're absolutely right, Matt. Where I was coming from with that idea of consent is I think if there had been an opportunity for consent or even a conversation, what that could have done, not just for Ellie, but even more so for Joel to be able to say goodbye. Because in both of those contexts, he didn't get to say goodbye to his daughter because his daughter died abruptly at the beginning of the video game in season 1. And here he is again having to abruptly say goodbye. And just that idea of like, you see it in the show. Pedro Pascal plays a great Joel, but you also see it in the video game where, just no, this in the face, you just see that change happen of like trauma response almost of like, no, I'm not going to let that happen. So great points, great conversation. Matt, I'd love to hear a little more of your perspective again, as somebody that is a scientist. I know you don't specialize in mushrooms, but yeah, what's your thoughts about this idea, especially, you know, because I know some of the work you do has to do with developing research. I don't know if you do things with vaccines specifically, but how do we prevent disease? How do we cure diseases, heal diseases? Like, what are your thoughts about, you know, this idea of creating a vaccine in a post-apocalyptic world? I want to know how hard would that be?
Yeah.
You know, because you don't have the facilities to produce en masse, you know, all these vaccines. But then also just, your input as a scientist of like this concept of post-apocalyptic world by mushrooms and all that fun stuff. I'll stop talking and let you talk.
Yeah, I probably know just enough to speak on it in a way that people who know nothing about it will be like, wow, this guy knows a lot. And people that actually know about immunology
now you've just destroyed the illusion. You could have been like the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
You've pulled the curtain back.
I will say, as someone who, because I specifically like work in the world of RNA-based therapeutics. And so I would be curious to see, what does The Last of Us what does the story of The Last of Us look like if it's written in a post-COVID pandemic world where we have mRNA vaccines as this, a technology that has been in development for decades, but finally people are taking seriously? Because, my background in immunology is essentially that when I was in grad school getting my Ph.D., 2 of the labs that I rotated in were immunology labs. So, take with a grain of salt, but I guess essentially my understanding of the way that on a very basic level that vaccines work is, you have your innate and your adaptive immune system, and the innate immune system is essentially like the frontline infantry. It's the meat grinder that it doesn't specifically target anything, but it can target everything that comes into your body on a very mediocre level, and is essentially just trying to stop things from getting out of hand, while the adaptive immune system figures out specifically what is happening and develops, the precise weapons to attack said invader. And so the way that the adaptive immune system works is that, it's sort of like whether it's a virus or a bacteria or a fungus, when something infects you, your cells of your immune system come, they fight it and, kill some of the invading pathogen. And then they take a piece of it called the antigen, and they go back and they present it to these special cells and say, look, this is a piece of the enemy. Figure out how to find and kill this thing. And then those cells adapt specific ways of binding to that antigen. And those are what's called antibodies. And so now you have antibodies that can very specifically and effectively target the antigen or the piece of that fungus or bacteria or virus. And so with a vaccine, what you're essentially trying to do is, rather than infect someone with a live version of the pathogen, you're giving them either just a piece of it or a dead version of it, so that you don't put the person at risk, but you're introducing their immune system to it to say hey, here's something you need to look out for. And then you'll maybe mix something in that makes the body upset to be and this should make you angry. And then the immune system's okay, I'm going to take this sort of wanted poster of I'll keep an eye out for this guy, wanted dead or alive, if he ever shows his face around here in the future. And so on a biological level, how does Ellie have immunity where others don't? I mean, I know in the show, the way that they explain it in season 1 is that essentially just as the cordyceps are crossing the umbilical cord, it gets cut. And so it's sort of this tiny little microdose of cordyceps. And so it's not enough to infect her, but enough for her body to mount a defense against. And so, I mean, that makes sense to me on some level from an immunological standpoint, but it then raises questions as to, well, why can't you microdose the rest of the populace with cordyceps in the way that traditional vaccines are developed? So
then it wouldn't be an engaging story. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know why they would have to harvest her brain in order for the vaccine to develop, because my understanding is that whatever her immune system is doing to make her immune, that's happening in her lymphatic system and in her circulatory system, not in her nervous system. But
yeah. I appreciate your explanation there, Matt. That was really great. I did miss, at what point in that process does autism occur?
I'm so glad you asked. It doesn't, actually. Yeah. If anyone listening is still under the illusion that vaccines cause autism, it was just one paper that said that everyone likes to go back and look at, and it has been well established that the data in that paper was fabricated, and it has since been retracted. So there is zero credible peer-reviewed evidence to link autism with vaccines. And actually, I do research now on one of the genetic bases of autism spectrum disorder. So I can tell you that it definitely is not linked to autism, at least in the cases that I work on. But broadly speaking, no link at all.
All right. If you say so. I don't believe you, but okay.
I love it. This is going a little bit back, but when we were talking about why does Joel make the decision he makes? And I also think it's important to talk about attachment, right? And how when we love somebody, we form these secure attachments. And I think for Joel, when he had the trauma of losing his daughter, Sarah, it was again, he didn't have any kind of attachment. And so I think that earned attachment that he forms with Ellie is a really profound part of his decision-making process too. He doesn't want to lose that attachment again. So I just wanted to throw, a little bit of attachment theory out.
No, I hadn't thought about attachment theory. And that's a great point too. Like, how does our secure bonds, especially with our caregivers, impact our ability to navigate loss, trauma, grief? Yeah. No, that's great. I love that, Kailey. So we've talked a lot about season 1 and in part 1, and I want to create a space here if you guys have any other thoughts about part 1, season 1. But now's the time to do it before we jump into season 2 and Last of Us part 2. Any thoughts about the first game, the first season that we haven't touched on?
Can I just ask both of you as video gamers, and this could certainly tie into season 2 as well, but
yeah,
what is it in particular that you guys feel, just because I'm not a video gamer, about that particular medium that you find, significant, powerful, meaningful? Because I do think there's something very unique about being immersed in something versus just like watching it, reading. I think there is something unique about video games.
Excuse me, Matt, do you want to take us off?
Yeah, I think there are games that do it exceptionally well. There are games that do it somewhat well. And then there are games that I think don't necessarily take advantage of the medium in this way at all. But that, like, one of the things that can make video games uniquely powerful as a medium, aside from film, books, TV, things like that, is that it is interactive. And when there's a playable character, the actions of that character are not just their own, it's also yours, since you're the one controlling them. And so I think part of what makes the ending to that first game really powerful, and where the second game really shines in just upping the ante exponentially, is that you're complicit in the acts of Joel, specifically at the end of the game. That even if you disagree with his actions on some level, like, you also carried them out. And it's, sort of this dissonance that the player has, in that, at any point you can put the controller down and not commit the atrocities that Joel does in order to, quote unquote, rescue Ellie at the end of the game. But also, if you were to do that, the story would just end. It's not that, like, it continues down a different path. But I think that is some of the power, is that you're not just sitting there going, I can't believe he did that, but you're sitting there going, I can't believe I just did that.
Yeah. No, I 1,000% agree. And taking into our second game, taking to season 2. Sorry, my dogs just barked. They got upset about something. But following Matt's point,
is there a man breaking into your house to save his teenage daughter?
There must be. I didn't even know she was in here. How'd she get in? Oh. But following Matt's point, into season 2 episode, or part 2, yes. And Matt, you and I have talked about this, back when the game came out during COVID, part 2 did, in 2020. That game, the part 2 in particular, makes you do things that you're, as the player, like, I don't want to do this anymore. Stop. But the game makes you do it. And you're right. At any point in time, you could set down the controller, you could walk away. But I think that also speaks to how enthralling the narrative of the games are, that you don't want to stop. You want to see what happens. You want to see what happens next. But in particular, the second game, we talk a lot. Not we, but people talk a lot about how video games are so violent, and they're terrible and blah, 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 blah. We could have a whole conversation about that.
It's not glorifying, though. I'll tell you that.
Right. It's one of the few games that justifies so much its use of over the top violence.
Yeah.
It is one of the most violent games
like there's
I've ever played.
There's very much an intention behind what's going on. Like, I speak a little more on that, Matt, if you don't mind, when you said it doesn't glorify violence, because I totally agree.
Yeah, because I think that what is off-putting about some people about violence in video games, I mean, there's certainly the superficial level of people just, I mean, you go back to the 90s with Mortal Kombat, and it's just like kids are playing this.
Finish him.
Yeah, and there's blood and people are dying, and that's bad. But I think that on a deeper level, and where there is, like, some credible concern, even if it is not necessarily backed scientifically with outcomes, is that there's this concern that trivializing violence in video games will result in it being trivialized in real life. And I think that actually the opposite ends up happening in practice, is what the data has shown from what I've seen. But that I think that is still a legitimate concern, is that you don't want someone going in, committing horrible atrocities in a game, being desensitized to it, and then thinking it's not a big deal. But what I think on the flip side that The Last of Us Part 2 really does is it makes you sit with the gravity and the feelings of disgust related to those acts. And so it almost is like a vaccination against real world violence, because it causes you to really face and sit with the implications of the impact of that, whether it is just the horror of taking someone's life or the way that the flipping of the narrative in part 2 really shows you that, like, okay, like this, I killed this character in the first part of the game, and now in the second part of the game, I get to see, like, oh my God, this person had a whole full life. Maybe they were expecting a child, or, you know, even if it's just like a beloved pet of a character that, you know, it's a faceless, nameless person to you at first, but then suddenly you realize, like, oh no, they had this entire life and hopes and dreams behind it.
Yeah, Ellie can kill all the people in the world, but as soon as she kills that pet dog, now she becomes the villain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, I want to just piggyback on what you just said, Matt, because again, this could be a whole nother podcast episode. But yes, my research, what I've seen, video game violence actually has the opposite effect. It actually creates empathy in human beings more often than not. Now, that could be a fake citation, but
yeah,
having said that,
needed, Steve.
Yeah, right. But it's fake. It's all right. The government makes up fake citations now, so we're fine.
Right.
But yes, more often than not, video game violence does lead to the player, even in games like Grand Theft Auto, can lead, because that's specifically the research that I've looked at has said players that play Grand Theft Auto, because, you know, you're playing a criminal, but you're doing some terrible things in that game. But people that play that actually end up having more empathy and don't act out on those types of behaviors in real life.
And from what I've seen, it's can also serve as almost like a cathartic release of negative and violent impulses. Because, you know, as much as we would like to believe that we are a domesticated species as humans, biologically speaking, we are the most violent primates on the planet. The next closest is chimpanzees. They also will go to war between one another. But what separates humans and chimps, even though both of our brains literally become aroused when we see violence, if chimps line up to go to war and they do the calculus in their brains and see, like, oh, they have exactly as much power as we do, this is just mutually assured destruction, the chimps will sort it out and call off the fight and be like, no one wins here. We just need to figure this out. Humans, historically speaking, we'll just say, like, well, at least he'll be dead. I'll be dead too, but at least he'll be dead. And we'll still go through with the mutually assured destruction. And so
it's such the cycles of violence, I think, are depicted so powerfully in this show and video game. And I do think that, you know, it almost comes across. I was thinking about this morning, a bit like a Greek tragedy, you know, because I think about the Greek tragedy, this King Agamemnon, they're going to war against the Trojans. So he's a Greek king, and the gods are mad for some reason. And so they can't get their ship across the ocean. And so he comes to terms and that he's going to have to sacrifice his daughter in order to appease the gods. Well, when he gets home from war, his wife's not too happy about that. So she ends up killing him. But then his son gets angry because, wait a minute, you killed my dad. So his son ends up killing his mom. So just these cycles of violence, I think that this show just does such a powerful job of exemplifying. I mean, I think there's a reason that the show creators or the video game creator, I believe, really base pieces and parts of this on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and these cycles of violence that we see play out in our world tragically and horrifically. And I often wonder, like, if we could just see the shared grief and actually knew how to navigate that as a culture, I think that we would not have cycles of violence. I think community grief care and talking about grief collectively is, I think, really preventative against mass violence, because when it comes down to it, Ellie and Abby, you know, these two teenage characters who both lose a father, or Ellie, a father figure, like, it's the same grief. Like, it's not the same grief. That's not what I mean. But like, their experiences are very parallel, right?
Yeah.
And what would it
very
look
similar?
Like? Yeah. If those that common grief and that common humanity could be highlighted. There's a really great documentary called In Counterpoint about a parents' grief group in Israel, and it's comprised of both Palestinian parents and Israeli parents.
Oh, wow.
And again, that shared grief is really preventative against, cycles of violence. So that was kind of a side tangent. I apologize.
It was a good side tangent.
Well, thank you.
No, yes, Kailey, I think you're right. The Neil Druckmann, the creator of the video game, definitely used, and he's Jewish, used the concept of what was going on. And this is before the current war happening in Gaza, but was using that conflict as a way to, how do we cultivate empathy? Which is what I think the ultimate goal of the video game is. And I imagine they're trying to do for the TV show, because it leaves off at the halfway point of the video game. So you know where it ends, Matt, in the theater with Abby holding the gun.
Yeah.
But
I'm assuming we're getting into full spoilers for part 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think that could be, knowing where season 2 of the TV show leaves off, I feel like that could be one of where, like, season 1 of the show, I feel like did a really good job of retelling the story of part 1 and carrying the gravity of all of those decisions. I feel like that could be getting to our earlier conversation about the hands-on interactive nature of video games as a medium, where season 3 of the show, I think, could really lose some of its power, is that part 2 of the game, part of what makes it such a powerful experience is that it forces you to walk a mile in the shoes of the enemy. And that really, when you get to that inflection point halfway through part 2, you're sort of like, I don't want to be Abby. Abby is the bad person. Abby is the one that killed Joel. And then by the time you get to the end of Abby's story, you're sort of, it's like that. Is it Inglourious Bastards, or is it a different movie that has to, like, wait, are we the bad guys? I don't know. It might be baddies.
It might be.
Of just, you realize that, like, it's not as black and white of, like, it was Ellie, the good guy, fighting Abby, the bad guy. And now suddenly you're like, oh, maybe Abby's the good guy. Well, maybe the point is that there aren't just good guys and bad guys.
Yeah,
but
it's really funny that you said that, Matt, because a friend of mine who has not played the video games and has only seen the show just finished season 2, and he texted me, and I'm quoting, I'm really not interested in rehashing season 2 of The Last of Us from Abby's perspective. Is this a thing they do in the game?
Yeah, it is. And as I think history has shown, if you check in on any user scored, like, Metacritic or like player discussions, highly divisive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was highly praised, huge, great reviews, 9s out of 10s, 10s out of 10s, but definitely people did not like that. And I do think the game score suffered slightly instead of like the first game where it was mainly 10 out of 10s. There was some 9s, maybe even a few 8s of just like, I didn't like this. But that is the piece and that I love, and why I love part 2 so much, and why I've played it all the way through from beginning to end 3 different times, is because of that switch and the fact that I'm in these moments and I'm forced to do things, one, that I as a player don't want to do, that are awful, but also, and this is full spoilers for The Last of Us Part 2, so just know that. But boy, we talk about the cycle of violence, and we can touch on this because that's part of the theme of the game. But the fact that because Ellie in particular can't let go of her grief, can't let go of her loss, she pays the ultimate price. And the last connection she has to Joel, which is music and being able to play the guitar, she loses 2 of her fingers and she can't play the guitar anymore. And,
I think
that is just the most heartbreaking thing. Go ahead, Kailey.
Yeah, I think grief can make us feel frozen in time. So I think it's fascinating that Joel's daughter, Sarah, gives him a watch. And when Sarah dies, the watch just gets shot and breaks.
Yeah.
The watch is frozen at the exact time that Sarah dies. And it's an interesting commentary on how grief does make us feel like we are completely frozen in time, even though the world around us is continuing to go on. It's like our worlds have completely stopped. Like time literally has stopped. And I know, again, a lot of bereaved parents will share that it feels like, time has stopped. And there's not even a word for bereaved parents. When we lose a spouse, we have the word widow, or widower. We don't even have a word for the depth of what that grief really is.
So when you say grief gets frozen in time, Kailey, it sounds like for Ellie, then music is her way of time kind of, what would you say, it's freezing, or would you say that it's her way to I mean, we talk about continuing bonds,
Mm-hmm.
definitely. And maybe you can speak on that, but that's her continuing bond to Joel then.
Oh, I think so. And that's what's so tragic about the fact that, because of the consequences of violence and kind of maladaptive coping to grief, like she doesn't have that connection anymore.
Yeah.
She's not able to experience that connection to Joel in the same way because of the violence. So yeah, again, I mean, massive collective grief in this world, right? But again, I think it's parallel to, gosh, I mean, I don't think that we've even begun to unpack the collective grief that we all experienced during COVID-19. Like we just don't deal with it as a culture. We just kind of keep moving on and keep going forward. But again, I think if we don't take a look at it and if we don't engage with it, we have these maladaptive cycles that are not productive.
It is interesting to hear you really highlight that feature of like time freezing with grief, Kailey. I don't think I had ever really heard that before and really appreciated the symbolism of Joel's watch stopping in time. But it does make me think, as it relates to the COVID pandemic, that one of the most common things I feel like you still hear about it 5 years later now is people's just disbelief at how much time has passed since then, that it still feels like we are like in like it has only been like a few months or a couple years, that like everyone's sense of time feels off now, just collectively. And I had never really pieced it together that it's related to that grief process. And I think that like even in my own life, the times that I have experienced grief or like am experiencing grief is that like one of the things that makes that really hard, aside from just the loss itself, is that especially because of the culture that we live in, you feel like you have to keep going. And what you want to do is stop and sit and process and like work through, but life doesn't allow that. And so it just feels like it's almost like you're being dragged behind a car. And just getting wounded along the way because like you can't move, but you're being forced to move.
Yeah. It speaks to death rituals. I'm thinking of the Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva and how important that is, that we take time to sit and process. Yeah, especially in our white Christian, centric world that I know the three of us kind of grew up in, but also that a lot of our country kind of still, if not directly involved with, is still, I mean, it's a huge cultural influence, Christianity in America and in Western Hemisphere, but we don't make room for that. We don't have like a ritual or tradition, especially as Americans.
Well, and we don't have those outward outlets for our grief. My mentor, Dr. Wolfelt, always says that the difference between grief and mourning is that mourning is grief gone public. It's those outward expressions that we can, have space to articulate that, time feels like it's stopped, like, different rituals that we can maybe utilize or practice to kind of symbolize that and articulate that. But I think you're so right, Matt, that in our culture, there is this sense of, we maybe get a day or two for bereavement leave in our culture if we're lucky, right? And then we're just kind of expected
best case scenario, you have 48 hours to process.
Right. Or, you have headlines. I just saw one recently. Kobe Bryant's wife is still grieving. I'm like, why do we have the still in there? Of course she is, right? I think, again, it's just pretty cool that a video game, I think, can get us talking about grief in such a in-depth way. Pretty cool.
I mean, to that point of how long of a process it is, it's been long enough since I played part 2 that I don't remember the exact time gap, but there is a time gap in the game, right? That like have this inflection point partway through the game. And ultimately Ellie decides to walk away for a time, right? And then like years pass.
At least. Because
we jumped from Dina being pregnant to Dina and Ellie have like a toddler at home, right? And so it's been at least 1 to 2 years. But what we can see is that, like Tommy comes back, he shows up, and the wound is still fresh enough that it's able to draw Ellie back in, that even in all that time, she has not moved through that grief and like come to a place of being okay with it.
She's not moved forward with her grief. I always tell people we don't move on with our grief, we move forward with it. And I think Ellie is such a case study in complicated grief, when there are those additional barriers that literally do just freeze us, and we do have that inability to kind of move forward with our grief.
Yeah. I'm curious, Kailey, in your experience and expertise, just the way that you described it just then made me really think of an addict and how, like, I'm curious to what extent you think it's similar in that, like, someone can have an addiction to something and can, no longer be abusing a substance or a behavior, but they never stop being an addict necessarily, in that, like, it can be years since you've touched a bottle or used a drug, but that, like, it still requires constant vigilance because you can get pulled right back into it in the same way that Ellie gets pulled right back into it.
Oh, so well said. I think grief is something chronic. We don't always view it that way. And that doesn't mean that the acute intensity of our grief that we experience in the immediate aftermath of a loss, stays at that intensity, right? It ebbs and it flows, and, we cycle through that. But I do think it's chronic. And I also think it's why we suck at it in our culture. We don't like things that don't have this neat, tidy, and, beginning and end point. It's not like the flu where we can say, like, in 48 hours, you're going to feel better, or, take this pill and you're going to feel better. Grief is so much more nuanced and complex than that. And so again, that's where I think, goodness, Ellie and Abby, right? If they had just been in a grief support group together, right? Maybe we wouldn't have, no, I'm just joking. But just that again, there's so many parallels between their experiences. They're both frozen in their grief.
Yeah. I want to just quickly shift gears and talk about this real quick. I want to talk about relationships and the way that sex and intimacy, especially in The Last of Us, is portrayed. And we should note that there is a very significant character in the TV show that we haven't been introduced to yet, who is trans, Lev. And there's a lot of religious trauma. We get hints of it in the TV show. We'll get a lot more of that in season 3. One of the big things in the video game when it came out not only had to do with Ellie being queer, which I think was hinted at in the first game, and definitely in DLC it was hinted at. It was very much, I think, expressed in the first season that Ellie was queer. But one thing that I'd like to talk about is the way that we portray certain characters, especially as we go from television to screen. Because in the television, and this was a big debate, Matt, I'm sure you remember this, about the character of Abby. And the character of Abby in particular is very physically built, very, in terms of Western culture, very masculine.
Yeah.
And just want to kind of get your input. And Kailey, because Matt and I are, let's first of all recognize we're all white. We're all cisgender. We're all heterosexuals. Matt and I are men. And Kailey, the woman perspective here, in the series, Abby's very physically built, very masculine. And what does that say, especially because she's initially portrayed as such a villain? And then in the TV show, she's not as physically built. What does that say about the way our culture might engage in certain characters or portrayals around femininity? And what conversations does that kind of bring to light for us to kind of be more mindful of as we talk about these things? Because I think, and Matt, you too, if you can remember, like, people did not like the Abby character, particularly because of the way she was built.
Yeah. I think that's one of the toxic aspects of quote unquote gamer culture, is that, like, as a historically and currently still very male dominated subculture, that it has a history of misogyny, and that there is at least I would like to think, very small but very, very vocal minority online that seems to think that if all female characters in video games, like, they have to be portrayed in a way that you would want to have sex with them. And so when a character like Abby comes on and it's not a traditional feminine character that you're just like, well, I would have sex with Abby, that, like, suddenly, like, it's not good. And it's like, well, maybe female characters can represent more than just something you would want to sleep with, and they can be people.
Yeah. And in reverse, a lot of people don't like the actress that plays Ellie for that exact reason, because the actress isn't as attractive as the character in the video game.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are your thoughts, Kailey?
Yeah. Well, and I think too, and not to harp on the grief stuff, but I do think there's some interesting conversations to be had about masculine versus quote feminine grief. And we often associate, the way that Joel's responding to grief it's aggressive and it's violent. Of course, I think that's all of the characters. But one of my favorite scenes in the TV show is the relationship between two pretty minor characters, I believe, in the video game, Frank and what is Frank's partner's name? Stephen, help me out.
Bill.
Frank and Bill. Yeah. It's this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful queer love story that I think just gorgeously captures true vulnerability and true intimacy in a way that just, I think, is such a gift to the audience to see that portrayed. So those are some of the thoughts that kind of are popping in my head when we talk about, gender and The Last of Us.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that, because we did skim over that.
And that's also a relationship that in the first game was hinted at as Bill was gay, because you can find a note in the game that hints at that, Bill calls Frank his partner, and you're sort of like, what kind of a partner? And then you find a note, or you can stumble upon a note that sort of implies that there was a romantic and a physical component to their relationship that then the show really obviously blows out in episode 3 of season 1. But again, was simultaneously the most critically acclaimed episode of season 1 and the most
different,
publicly divisive episode.
Most criticized too.
Yeah. It was a beautiful episode. And in the video game, you're right, it is hinted at, but the relationship in the video game, based off of, if I remember the note and the way that Frank talks about Bill, or Bill talks about Frank, it wasn't as the level of connection, romance, the way that the Bill character cared for Frank wasn't there in the video game. That was there in the TV show, which again was awesome.
Yeah, I think it was nuanced enough in the same way that like Ellie as a queer character was nuanced enough in part 1 of the game before the Left Behind DLC, which made it very overt that she was attracted to women, that it was nuanced enough that if you are a bigoted player, that you could convince yourself that it was not there. There was reasonable doubt that you could cast on it in a way that the show and the DLC and season or part 2 of the game just remove any of that doubt. And I think that is why some people really pushed back against it, because they had convinced themselves that these characters were one thing when in reality they were not.
Yeah. One question that I have for both of you is, when we talk about romance and we have Ellie and Dina that are really working hard to care for each other, especially in the video game. And it's interesting, Matt, and again, you haven't seen the TV show, very similar beats, but slightly different. And definitely certain events are kind of spread out a little differently in the video game. Very early on, Ellie and Dina connect, and it's very much heavily implied they have sex. That doesn't happen till much later in the video game, actually not until after.
Much later in
Ellie
the TV show, you mean?
Or, excuse me. Thank you. Much later in TV show, after Ellie learns that Dina is pregnant. So sorry, Matt, spoiler alert. But I'm kind of curious, how do you guys feel that in the show, if here's people connecting and we talk about, how do we heal? How do we work through grief? How do we prevent violence? One thing that I'm thinking about is if love is one of the ways that we can connect, build relationships, and maybe even, quote, give us, why does it often lead to death and destruction in not just in The Last of Us, but in the world? And how do we work through that? And I think you already touched on this, Kailey. We don't process our grief, but I want to get a little bit more like in terms of the relationship piece, and especially in terms of sex. How does that define who we are in crisis and who we choose to become afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually teaching a course right now on sexuality and grief, and we talk about this term called sexual bereavement. What happens to our sexuality when we experience loss? And for some folks, there's an increase in wanting to engage, in that way, and then for others, there's a very much the opposite. Like, we've experienced this huge loss. How could you even expect me to want to engage? You know, kind of in that capacity. So it is interesting though, because I think sexuality is kind of, maybe it's this life-giving thing for those in grief. And yet there's often this double-barreled taboo where we don't really talk about grief and we don't really talk about sexuality. And so there's, again, not a lot of spaces, even for folks who, they experience maybe a loss of a partner and they'll come to me for counseling and they're embarrassed to even broach the topic or to even say like, I'm a young widow. Like, what does this mean for my, my sexuality for the next 3, 4, 5 decades? Like, is that part of me just over? Or like, what do I do with that part of me?
Mm.
So I think it's a good question. I don't have a magic answer, but there is very little research on this intersection, though. Very little research.
Makes me think of right now, we're watching season 1 of the TV show Silo on Apple TV. And we just watched an episode where the main character is talking to her dad about in the past when her brother died. And so, her parents lost a son, and the way that affected her specifically because of the way that it affected her parents. And that one of the things that her dad says to her in that moment is, grief affects everyone differently. It causes some people to turn inwards and try to make their world smaller. And it causes other people to turn outwards and try to do something to make it right. And how he turned inwards and his wife turned outwards. And so they were sort of like two diverging paths, and that was why their relationship fell apart. And so that what you said, Kailey, makes me think of that that is one of the complicated things about grief, is that different people process it differently, that there's not like a correct way.
No.
Yeah.
It's not a test that you get graded on.
I'm also reminded of the TV show Grey's Anatomy, where early in the show, one of the main characters, George, his dad dies.
When you say early in the show, do you mean like season 18?
Correct. Yes. No, actually, I think season 2 or 3.
Okay.
The main character, really early in the show, where one of the characters, George, his dad dies, and the way he copes is by having lots of sex, which for that character was very out of character. It wasn't normal for him to do. He was came across as very prudish in the show, very pure. And when he lost this person, all that kind of went out the window in order to cope and not think and not deal. So yes, we all deal with grief differently. And when it comes to sex, a lot of people have a hard time moving on. A lot of people want to do the opposite. And especially in our Western culture, there can be a lot of guilt and shame around that, especially if we grew up with conservative values around sex, religious values around sex. It's really hard to let go of. So any thoughts before we wrap up today about The Last of Us, around grief, around science, around sex, around relationships?
I'm excited to watch season 2 of the show as someone who loved season 1 and loved both games. I unfortunately just don't have as much time for TV now that I have a toddler running around and causing mayhem all the time. But I have been following.
You have your own little cordyceps that's just
exactly.
Running around.
Yeah, my life is infected now. But I have been following some of the discourse online, and it seems like it's a very divisive season, and which I think echoes very well the divisiveness of part 2 of the game. And so I'm sort of curious to get a firsthand experience so that I can understand how much of the aspersions that are being cast are legitimate criticisms versus people just not liking certain people or ways of living life because they don't align with that person's values.
Yeah, it's really hard. It has to be really hard for the television viewer, because The Last of Us Part 2 is a long game. I think it's twice as long, if not more so, than the first game.
Yeah.
And you're only getting a half, maybe even a third of the game in the first season. And so there's so much more story to tell that does a lot of work in helping you as the viewer, as the person engaging in the story, like connect with all these different themes. And we've barely, if you recall, Matt, the first half of the game, you barely touched the surface. We haven't met, we've been introduced to the Scars, but we don't know anything about them, the Seraphites. We've been given a lot more about the Isaac character who leads the Wolves, but we still don't have a lot of context about the current conflict. We don't have any of the themes of religious trauma yet. We don't have our trans character and how trans people are often treated within religious culture and our culture at large. There's so many things we haven't touched on yet. So, it has to be hard for the television viewer who's only getting a fraction of the narrative.
Yeah. And I will also say that I remember when I got to the end of part 2 back in, I guess it was 2020 when it came out, that sort of my takeaway and my response to it was similar to when I have watched certain movies. Like one that I frequently will equate it with is the movie 12 Years a Slave, which I think won Best Picture that year, or was at least nominated.
Yeah.
But like both when I got to the end of that movie and when I got to the end of that game, I just sat there feeling so many things and thought to myself, that was incredible and so powerful, and I never want to experience it again.
Yeah.
And so there is just something different about someone like you, Steve, who continues to go back to that game over and over and over again, where it's like, I mean, it's so powerful, and so I can see why, but it also is like so, I don't know, deeply affecting and not particularly uplifting in a way that I think it's powerful and it's important to experience, but can be difficult to retread.
I think it can be. I think for me, it's a little bit therapeutic, especially in the current world we're living in, where we don't have empathy and we don't have the ability to process out loud, or at least have conversations, sensible conversations with people of like, I think for me, it's therapeutic. I validate everything you said, though, Matt. For me, it's Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream. I've seen that movie once and it was amazing, but I will never watch that movie again.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's
Definitely, that movie is also definitely in that camp as well.
Yeah. Kaylee, any last thoughts about The Last of Us before we got out of here?
I think the last thing I'll say, and then we can, say goodbye, is just, I'm just struck by the power of good storytelling. I think stories change us and shape us in ways that, are just really significant. So, just the power of storytelling.
Yeah. And that's probably the other thing that keeps bringing me back to the video game, too. It's the story is just, especially the second half, which I'm most looking forward to season 3, because that's where I think so much of the good stuff, the Abby narrative, is so good. So, Matt, one thing that we do when we wrap up is we ask the question, what are we reading? What are we watching? And what are we playing? So we'll let you start. What are you reading, watching, and or playing?
Oh, gosh. Right now? I guess the book that I have been sort of on again, off again reading is Video Game of the Year, I think is what it's called, by Jordan Miner.
Okay.
And it like starts back in the 80s and then goes up through like the early to mid 20s. And just like each chapter, the author Jordan Miner picks a different game that is his game of the year for that year, but not necessarily the traditional pick. And so you don't have your Ocarina of Time necessarily, but it's another great game. And then there will be like a page at the end where 2 or 3 people will chime in with their alternative picks as well. And so that has
so what did he pick instead of Ocarina of Time?
Hold on, I'll grab it. I have it right here.
Okay, all right. He's grabbing it. This is what happens when you get 2 video game nerds talking on a podcast.
So Ocarina of Time, that was 98, right? Not 97. So 98, he picked Metal Gear Solid. So also a solid pick, but it has some really great art and just some compelling cases, and is a fun little historical retrospective as well. So I'm reading that. Gosh, what did we just finish watching?
Well, you said you were watching Silo.
That's yeah. So we're currently watching season 1 of Silo, but we just finished season 2 of Andor.
Yeah.
Which somehow is even better than season 1. I was so worried up until the critic scores started coming out that I was like, oh my God, somehow it scored even higher, and it very much deserved it. So even if you're not into Star Wars, people should check out Andor, because it's just a really solid, it's an impressive story and impressively written in a way that if you've seen the Star Wars movies, you know how everything ends and who makes it out and who doesn't, but you're still worried for them the whole time somehow. And then what I'm playing right now is a little game called Claire Obscure Expedition 33, which is one of the surprise game of the year contenders for this year from a small little first time French studio. This is their first game. And it's not a JRPG technically, because it's not out of Japan.
But it's in that tradition, right?
It's in that tradition, yeah. So it's from a French studio, but it's a JRPG, and also has some interesting themes surrounding grief and loss and what it looks like to live in a world where you're powerless to save the people who are ripped from you. And if anyone was intrigued by those themes in The Last of Us, I would say check out the first 1 to 2 hours of Claire Obscure and see if it doesn't grip you, because it's a game that just really, right from the gate, doesn't drag its feet in pulling you into the story and the world.
All right, very cool. We should note that you have your Samus shirt on too.
I do, yes. My Super Metroid t-shirt.
Yes. And I think I spent 5 minutes at the end of our last podcast plugging Andor too. So thanks for piggybacking on that.
Yeah,
you're really
good. You have good taste. Can confirm.
I have it recorded now that you said that, and you can never say otherwise.
Yeah, just pull this audio clip out and carry it with you for the rest of your days.
I will. Kailey, what about you? What are you reading, watching, or playing?
I am reading a book called The Myth of the Spoiled Child, which is really kind of taking aim at kind of some cultural discourse we have right now that kids are entitled little brats, kind of saying that really, all generations have kind of said that about kids. So it's more about maybe we just don't like kids, and that's a problem. We're not really a culture that likes kids.
Well, like Matt did say that his kid was infecting his life.
Well, technically, my kid has hand, foot, and mouth disease right now, so he literally is infecting.
So literally,
yeah.
I'm so sorry. But yeah, super kind of paradigm shifting kind of a book for my brain. What am I watching? I don't want to admit what I'm watching.
Why?
Secret Life of Mormon Housewives.
No.
So good.
Disgusting, we talked about you degenerate. I can't believe you would admit that on air. You should be ashamed of yourself.
I know.
No, we talked about how we should do a whole episode on that, or even do like some let's watches of the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, because it's kind of fascinating a little bit. I do not care a whole lot for reality TV, but even I will admit just some of the religious the religious implications of the Mormon religion and how that impacts these women's lives. And then the loopholes, the logic loopholes that they can go through of like, we can't have caffeine, but I am going to do a hard drug or something like that.
Right.
It's very interesting.
Caffeine, but I'm going to do some ketamine.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, okay.
All right. Yeah. So reading, watching, great. And you're not much of a gamer. You're not playing anything right now, right, Kailey?
Afraid not.
Kaylee's playing Minesweeper on her Windows 95.
I don't even know what that is.
If I said solitaire, would you get that reference, Kailey?
I would get that.
Okay,
reference.
great.
Yes, I would get that.
Well, I was playing The Last of Us Part 2, so I just finished that up. I did recently, for a couple of hours last night, play a little bit of Elden Ring now that Alex Garland is going to be directing an Elden Ring movie with A24. I don't know, man. I think that was enough of a revisit and I'm done. I just can't do the Souls-like games. They're just not my cup of tea. But I know you love them and they're part of one of your favorite games. So.
I do, but I can also appreciate that they're not for everyone. And one of the most important lessons I learned in high school in a media class is that there's a difference between saying that you love something and saying that something is good. And that you can recognize this and appreciate that something is good without liking it yourself.
Well, thanks for giving me permission to acknowledge that Elden Ring is probably a very good game. I do not like it.
Yeah, that's fair.
But I appreciate people who do. And then I'm watching, I have a good friend who turned me on to Nathan Fiddler and just started watching, actually watched and finished The Rehearsal on HBO, which is just, it's this weird blend of comedy and reality TV. And he has a TV show that he did for years called Nathan For You, which is much more reality TV, comedy based. I have lots of mixed feelings about Nathan Fiddler and The Rehearsal and Nathan For You. It feels at times it's very funny. At times it feels a little exploitive, maybe, of other people and people who are a little naive or might have some, maybe mental handicaps or disorders. But I do appreciate, especially the second season of The Rehearsal, is pretty fascinating. And some of the things that he is trying to do to improve airline safety. That was fascinating to watch. And also he ended up getting his not only his piloting license, but his commercial piloting license. So he could fly 747 all for the sake of this narrative. That was pretty cool to watch. So I do recommend watching, at the very least, the second season of The Rehearsal. All right. Thanks for being here, Matt. Thanks for talking with us. We really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun to have you here, man.
It was fun to be here. I'm glad I could make it.
Yeah. All right. Have a good day, everybody, and hopefully talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Can't it